Welcome to Case Files, the human factor. We are going to unpack and explore human behavior. And human behavior is fascinating. We're going to look at trauma, victimology, and I'm going to use all of my expertise over the last 25 years to really give you the gift of understanding human behavior and the fascination we've got with psychopathology, crime, victimology, criminal justice, mental health, forensics and statutory cases. And with that, I will, on my own and with the assistance of some of my guest speakers, really give you insight in what the human factor means in our lives and our daily existence. Welcome to the Human Factor. We've got Janette Hermann from South Africa, Johannesburg, from the Teddy Bear Clinic. And she's a social worker and busy with her master's degree in criminal justice. And what we are going to talk about today in the Human Factor is false allegations in proceedings where children are involved. And Janette, we've worked together on many projects, and you have assisted in my PhD on false allegations, and you are currently busy with false allegations master's degree. So very relevant that we speak to you, but it is good to just get a feeling of where are you at in Africa and on a global front, because I know your research is looking at it from a global perspective. And I just want you to talk to me about, from a very humanistic perspective that our audience can understand. So it's not professional language. We just want to really get a feeling of what it is to go through and your view on false allegations and how does that happen? Why does it happen?
So in my opinion, from a global perspective, there is a lack of research globally regarding false sexual abuse allegations, especially in custody disputes or divorce cases as well. There is limited research. From my research study that I've currently started, the additional research that I found was only from the UK and Canada and then from Australia, but it's very, very limited. And that is also a shortcoming that I mentioned in my own research study, especially from Australia's side as well, where it is based on only court papers, not with physical interviews that they've done with people. So we do see this as where the judicial system, there is a lack of knowledge from their side as well on cases like false sexual abuse allegations globally. So that is quite what we identified in the research as well.
Janette, now, obviously, I've published some papers on this topic, and I have completed a PhD in a number of years ago on this topic. But you and I have served as an ambassador at the Teddy Bear Clinic, and you work and serve at the Teddy Bear Clinic yourself in forensic cases. And there is a large or a sort of a big statistic and huge statistics on children that are victimized daily. And then we have on the other sort of side of this, some of these false allegations. But what is the role that it plays in a courtroom when, from your perspective, in an African court system, where false allegations are being made or not being made, and the other side of it is, but it's real allegations, factual allegations that are made. How does that work? And I'll provide sort of my views on that as well. But from you sitting systemically right there at the Teddy Bear Clinic doing the assessments, what is your views on that? Because we don't want to make mistakes on this. It's serious issues, and we want to really sort of know what is factual and what is sort of fabricated, or what is fabricated and false allegations.
For me, when a client walks into my office, which is a child, and there is an allegation of abuse, then my interview process that I do with the children My view would be is to look at the case at a holistic view, and also to look at all different angles of the case, not just with the child's disclosure. Is this child able to make a disclosure or not? Because with a lot of these cases, especially with the false sexual abuse allegations, the children are very young. They're less than 3 years old, where they do not have a voice. They cannot. Then there is these cases that's going to court. We can't assess children that's younger than 3 years old. They do not have the capacity to sit in an assessment, to even sit through an assessment as well. So with cases that we do see, I have personally seen cases with children that are able to verbalize. And when we do our forensic techniques that we learned how to interview these children with, the protocols that we use, it does come out that some of these children, there is a narrative that's not the child's narrative.
Yes.
And it is very, very clear for me as a professional when I interview the child, if the child has been abused or not. And even with cases where there is medical findings, where we know, okay, this is part of our process, there is a positive medical finding that this child has been sexually abused, then some children do not disclose due to several factors. And that is my main process as well, is to form a hypothesis about why is this child not disclosing, if there is actual evidence as well.
And obviously, we must not forget about the trauma associated with these cases. And I've seen often where individuals or the court process or the interviewer, they want specific information from the child, but the reality is we are working with significantly traumatized children that can't sort of do, you can't have all the ticks in the boxes because, okay, this is the perfect interview now. That means there's a false allegation or not a false allegation, because often, no matter which way we look at it, we are working then with traumatized children. It's difficult interviews, it's challenging interviews, and that needs to be considered, that kids cannot give perfect interviews. And it appears that there is a bit of a feeling in the judicial system that they want perfect interviews to prosecute or not to prosecute. And the reality is we're dealing with the human factor, where we're sitting with children that are small, that cannot actually provide these perfect interviews that people are seeking for.
Tanya, that is very correct. And even like at the Teddy Bear Foundation, we do provide the children that needs to testify with court preparation. But even during that process, these children are very much traumatized, and they are not able to go and stand there on the stand answering these questions, especially if it's not put to them in an age-appropriate manner or in a emotional capacity as well. Because if we look at the people that are questioning these children when they are on the stand, it's not mental health professionals. These are people with that are legal professionals, and they do not have the skills to ask children questions. And they do want, like you said, they do want a perfect interview with these children. And unfortunately, that cannot be upheld in a court of law.
So, Janette, where does that leave us? Because it's the reality, and people don't often like to talk about the reality. But where does that leave us in these kind of cases? Because we've seen that in these cases, often there's mistakes that's being made. It is complicated to determine and to have good evidence in front of the judge or the magistrate. So where does that leave the children in these cases where it's factual that these things has actually happened?
Tanya, so the children are very much part of the vulnerability population. And I think that should be taken into consideration when someone like a judge or a prosecutor is in a place where these type of processes needs to be followed, especially if there is medical evidence and there is a forensic assessment that was done by a professional, if their report is sufficient enough and if the correct protocols were followed, that should be considered instead of the child's testimony, because the child did provide the testimony in the forensic assessment.
Okay. So are you saying that there should be a point where enough evidence is enough evidence?
Correct. That is my professional opinion, is that if there's enough sufficient evidence, that should be taken to court, not for them to, just because it pleases the court to have a child put on stand, put the child through trauma and put them through several trauma factors as well. They have already been through the abuse. They've had to speak to several people. And when a child comes to my assessment room, I'm not the first person they've disclosed to. I'm not the first person to interview them. And that is also another problem, is when a child comes to me, I'm probably the fifth or the sixth person they've seen. They had to tell their story to. And that also creates another dynamic of a child's narrative.
Well, and the problem of contamination, Janette, because every time a child says something, there's a contamination that carries through, and there's a transference in another process, because a child, there's a narrative that changes, there's a word that changes, there's often a number of aspects that change in an interview, and that is very difficult because there is not a perfect sort of narrative in these kind of cases. And if it is too perfect, we have to know that that is a fact to consider, or a contributing factor, that is this not a false allegation? Because when there's a perfect story, that is for me a red flag. Is this not a narrative that has been created, a false allegation that has been created for personal gain? So in actual fact, we are not looking for the perfect story. But the problem is that if it's not a perfect story, it gives defense attorneys sort of a lot of fuel to build a case against, in essence, the child that has gone through a lot of trauma, because there is holes in the story, or it's been contaminated, and that obviously leads to problems in prosecution.
And we should also be mindful that when a child is put on a stand and the defense attorney, they interrogate the child. And I think that is also a very big problem, is they treat the child like the perpetrator. And the child also feels that my voice is not being heard. They feel like I'm lying, which in several cases children do. When they come to me, they ask me, don't you believe my story? Why do I have to tell you the story again? Because I've told so many other people the story. Why do people not believe me? And that is also creating additional trauma to the child.
And how often do you feel sitting in court, or sort of being very closely involved with children going through these court proceedings, that the victim offender role gets swapped around, where children walk out of the courtroom where they feel that, what did I do wrong? And obviously the long-term ramifications for that child to feel that they are not being believed.
Tanya, that happens very, very much often in court proceedings, where we do see that type of role being reversed, and where the child do feel like, what have I done wrong? And that also creates a whole different dynamic for the child, having to go through therapy as well. And it makes their healing process so much longer because of all of these additional factors that we now need to consider in a therapeutic process as well.
And if you look, you work closely with Dr. Shahida Omar, the clinical director of the Teddy Bear Clinic. What are the solutions in that? And then we'll go back to sort of false allegations, but what are the solutions in making the system better? If you look at the amounts of children that come through the clinic, and you see the devastation of what the children are being put through systemically, and it should be a system that helps children, but it seems to have sometimes the opposite effect. What is the answer if we can sort of hear what the Teddy Bear Clinic has to say, and the discussions between yourselves as practitioners with Dr. Omar? What is solutions here to on a global platform to really serve the best interests of children?
Tanya, so what we have seen with our reports that we submit to court, where we do a credibility as well as a competency to testify on behalf of the child, where we make recommendations if this child is able to testify or not. And if we do make a recommendation to say that this child will undergo undue mental stress, if this child has to be interviewed in the court, then we as professionals get questioned about how can we say that this child will have undue mental stress. And then we get interrogated as professionals, which I do understand, but for the opinion to say that this child will have undue mental stress, and which for us is a very big problem. And this is also now looking at the South African perspective on how our court systems work, because then they do not want a full forensic assessment. They only want you to say if the child is able to testify or not. And it's a one-page report where, which we can indicate that this is the results of our interview with the child, but then the court comes back to say that they wanted actually more information. And then we cannot provide it. Now we have to again put the child through an assessment process, another assessment process as well. So this is quite a very difficult dynamic where it feels for us like the court is creating this, the judicial system is creating this. And for us to go back to them and provide them with the sufficient knowledge and to educate them and create the awareness on what this actually does to a child. So that is where we find ourselves, is that the court system definitely needs to be educated.
Do you feel, Janette, that there's a gap between a child and the process? Because it feels that there's a gap between the reality of what happens in a child's life and the system and the resources available, and it's just not holding hands. They're not friends.
Definitely not, Tanya. So, if we look at the child's view and the child's world and what the child is experiencing, for them to go through such a process as a forensic assessment and then go to court, there is a very big disconnect, even from where the child comes to our offices and then from our offices to the court. Even with that process, there's a very big disconnect, and where our judicial system fails the children at the end of the day.
And I think that is the point, is there is a failure systemically on what we are trying to achieve. And I think we are trying, but there is still sort of a problem in the system of really serving children and meeting the child where they are at and what has happened to them. And for example, if we look at the opposite in these kind of challenging matters, where there is fabricated or false allegations, even in those kind of cases, does the system really, is it educated enough? Are people educated enough to really fully understand the complexities around that? Because often, we are seeing now, because there is a concept of false sexual abuse allegations, people are now saying, even in factual cases, no, it's false allegations, and that brings a ramification for the child that has said, but these things has happened, or it has not happened, and it creates a very complex sort of analysis for everyone involved.
Tanya, and if we take a look at the global perspective regarding the criminal procedures as well, it's innocent until proven guilty. And unfortunately, if a child goes through that system, like you mentioned, that this factually happened, and now the court is dismissing this as false allegations as well. This is a very problematic thing globally as well. And I think the additional trauma this creates for a child, it's very, very severe as well, because then they also, like I mentioned earlier, they do not feel their voices are being heard. And I don't think that our systems are educated enough, especially if we look at the voice of the child globally. Has this been implemented in all of the countries? Because it is in the United Nations children rights, and even for all of the countries, if either first world or third world countries, we do have acts in place to protect children, but it's not being implemented on ground level.
Janette, and I think that is holistically it's a big problem worldwide, is that there's a disconnect with what we are always or trying to achieve. I do think what is critical is to listen to children. And because children will give us the understanding what really happened. If people listen carefully to children, they definitely will get insight of, is this a factual case or is it a false case? But it's when people come with agendas, when they've lost neutrality, if they struggle to hear the child's voice, that is when things become problematic. And that is in the assessment process. It's through the systemic process that the child needs to go through. It's in the judicial process. Is we must not forget what is really the primary consideration is listen carefully to the voice of the child. Then you will know if this happened or if it didn't happen. And often, as what you've said rightfully so, is false allegations statistically, if we look at where does it fall statistically age-wise, is often when children cannot speak and they cannot tell their story. That's where parents take advantage and they manipulate information and they for their own personal narrative. But children that have a voice and that can speak can often tell the story, even if they're parentified or if there's alienation or if there's imprintment or transference. Professionals that have got the skills to listen to children and to understand their voice, if they listen effectively, children will tell you what has happened. It's the children that cannot speak where the problems lies, and often we see it's there where we find the most false allegations occur. And I want to be careful with the term false allegations because sometimes it is a misunderstanding. Sometimes there can be fabrication, but there's a complexity around that. But it is very important that people understand that false allegations is often found where children cannot speak. Children that can speak often speak the truth and they speak what has occurred. And it's important that we understand that as professionals and the court system. Have you got any last words, Janette, in just your research and the contribution? Because it's very much focused on insight in the judicial system and to see what the courts understand on this very important topic.
Tanya, so there is definitely a lack of education and a lack of awareness internationally with these type of cases, with this complexity as well, where also there is no understanding of the people that do make these false allegations, where the judges or the magistrates, they don't have the education or the skills to even identify when there is a complexity around these cases. For instance, if there is personality disorders involved as well, or if there's any additional mental health issues. So this is also where there is a lack of that globally as well.
Janette, and I think that is a very important point that you have made, and my research highlights that often in these kind of cases, it is contributing factors are obviously the children do not have a voice. Another contributing factor is the parent that is making the allegations, there's mental health concerns or an indication of personality disorders, and there's a history of that contributes to the person making or creating this narrative. So those are important aspects that the system and the judges and the magistrates need to understand is what is a personality disorder, what is poor mental health functioning. All of those concepts need to be really fully understood by the people that needs to consider the information that is put in front of them with regards to factual or false allegations in these kind of proceedings. Janette, thank you for your contribution on this. It is very important research that you are busy with. It's groundbreaking research because there is not a lot of publications on this topic. And obviously in the Teddy Bear Clinic, very important work that you do there with vulnerable people. And my heart obviously is very closely lies with the Teddy Bear Clinic, with the work that I've done there and the amazing work that you do and on children that has been victimized. So I'm sending my regards there to the Teddy Bear Clinic, and thank you for your insights on false and factual sexual abuse cases in the court system, and the contribution and what we need to consider and the factors that we can consider in these kind of cases. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya, and thank you so much for having me as well.